Think everyone younger than you is a millennial? You're in the right place for the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, AJ Matthew.
Hey.
AJ, today we're talking about bridging the gap and between generations. You know, one thing we hear a lot from churches is, man, we want to have a multi-generational ministry or an intergenerational ministry, but we're often not willing to do the hard work that it requires to actually have that kind of ministry. So a couple of things we want to do in today's episode. One, we want to help you understand the difference between millennials and Gen Z because they're actually not the same. They're different, and there's some differences. And then we want to give you some practical strategies that you can use that you don't need to have like separate ministries. Like we have a Gen Z ministry and we need to have a millennial ministry. In fact, that's kind of the opposite of what we're talking about today. But what are some ways that we can approach ministry that will help bridge the gap and between, you know, if you're a boomer or a Gen X person to these younger generations? Before we get into that, AJ, a little bit of housekeeping I wanted to mention. We didn't even talk about this before we went on air, but I would love it if you are listening to this podcast right now and you are in a safe place, like you're not driving.
Oh, okay. Now I'm really curious about what you're going to say.
Particularly if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. And we haven't asked this in a long time, but would you please just give us a good review? That just helps. There are way more of you who listen to this podcast than have ever given a review. And people pay attention to this. They scroll to the bottom and they go, oh, only, I don't know, we had like 30 something reviews. There are hundreds of you who listen to this podcast every week. On more than that, we have thousands of people who listen to this podcast every month, and you're not clicking that button, my friend. So I just need you to scroll down there and give us a review. It's just a favor I'm asking you.
That's a good idea.
From a millennial. You know, us millennials, we pay attention to the reviews at the bottom of a podcast.
Something that you care about. You value that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're a boomer or you're Gen X and you don't care about these things, do me a favor. Scroll down to the bottom, give us that 5-star review, help us out.
Yep. Okay. Well, one generation we won't be talking about today is Gen X because we're invisible and we like it that way. So leave us alone.
I think actually this is a good segue. I think people, again, and I don't want to make too many assumptions about the baby boomer generation, but I do think there is this, I encounter this a lot in my work with churches, is every person younger than me is millennial, which was the teaser here today, which totally ignores Gen X, which Gen X is fine with that. Just go ahead and ignore us, please. That's fine. That's our place. And it also, it doesn't take into account exactly how old millennials really are. And it also completely ignores Gen Z. And we're also not talking about, I think, what they're calling Gen Alpha, which is the youngest kids. But I think that's kind of we don't know. It's too early to tell on that group. So, AJ, why don't you kind of define these two generations? We're going to focus in on millennials and Gen Z, kind of give us the date ranges on that.
Yeah, so Gen Z, well, let's start with millennials. What are millennials? So 81, is that right? To 97 or 82?
1981 to 1996.
96, okay. And then Gen Z picks up 97 to 2012, all right?
Right.
So 80s and most of the 90s kids are millennials, and then late 90s, and then the first, decade of the 21st century are Gen Zs. So yeah, think about that 96, 97 breakpoint there.
The oldest millennials are in their 40s now. So when you say young whippersnapper millennial, they might be middle-aged.
The problem is the name. Why did your generation, Scott, why even call them millennials? That, I think because people associate the turn of the century with the term millennia. And I think so maybe that's why we old folks are always thinking, oh, kids was born in 2000 or something. It's a bad term. It's a bad generational term.
Even a kid born in 2000 is 23.
Yeah.
A kid born in 2000 isn't a kid.
They should have called them millennials. Really, Gen Z should have been called millennial, and your generation should have had something else.
I think what it is that we came of age when the millennial stuff was going on. So like, I have distinct memories. The Y2K,
early young adults at the turn of the century. That's
right. So I think whereas someone who's born in 2000 they don't remember Y2K. They don't remember any of that craze, and certainly don't remember 9/11 or any of those things. So I think that's probably why. But I didn't put the names on it, AJ. So just for the record, AJ, you are Gen X.
Right.
And I am a millennial, although I'm on the upper end of that age range.
And I'm similarly at the upper end of the Gen X range. Yeah. First, third, maybe a quarter. Yeah.
And you and I would both agree that we really don't understand or relate to the Gen Z, which your son, your oldest.
Both my sons. Yeah.
Both of your sons are Gen Z. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were talking about how there are some pieces of technology they use that we just can't even fathom why anyone would want to spend their time on it. So the point of this, guys, as we dive in, I do want to highlight some key differences between millennials and Gen Z, just so we have some understanding of, like, they're not the same. There are differences. But the broader point behind this is I want you to think like a missionary. If you say, oh, I want to be a multi-generational church. We want to reach the next generation, which we've talked about before on the podcast about a year ago or so. But if we want to do these things, you have to think like a missionary. If you wanted to go and you wanted to reach French people in France, you can't very well just do what you do as an American in France and think it's going to track, or in India or in Bolivia or in China. You have to understand the culture and the way that society is created now. These different generations really do have completely, I think this is the pace of society, AJ, like culture shifts so rapidly. This wasn't true 100 years ago. There was not a huge difference, generational gap, I don't think, between grandparents and grandchildren in terms of their view of the world and so on. But because of technology and because of how much the world has changed and how quickly, it's a whole culture gap between a baby boomer and someone who's in Gen Z. So we want to help you just understand those differences before we get into the practical things you can do.
The upside is on this, especially on Gen Z generation, from a missionary standpoint. Not that a ton of our listeners are in that space, but we do have a lot of people around the world. We've moved into a global culture in the youngest generations because they're using the same social media platforms, the same viral games and everybody's recreating the same videos over and over, and people all across the world in different language groups and cultures are doing the same stuff. So young people are acting more similar around the world because of social media and internet. So yeah, if you're in the international church space, or missionary, then I'm sure kids around the world are looking a lot more like the kids back home in America, because everybody's doing the same thing, weirdly. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need to get too sidetracked on this, but 2 points on that. One, there would be a lot of people, we will talk a little bit about this when we get to social issues here in a minute, but I guess I would observe that growing up in the 70s, AJ, as you did, 70s and 80s, you probably had, across the political spectrum, people would identify with that with the American flag. Like they would have some sort of affinity to the American
Yep.
flag
Yep,
growing
for
up
sure.
as an American teenager, right?
Yeah.
Whether you were like
Patriotism was there.
anti-establishment or whatever, it wouldn't matter. You would still have felt some sort of connection to that. Today's teenagers, particularly the ones who are unchurched, have an affinity to this Pride Progress flag, right? And that, to your point, AJ, that would be true of that demographic, that age demographic, in a place like the UK, in a place like France, and lots of places around the world. They would have an affinity with that flag, maybe over and above whatever their country's flag was. That's different. That's unique. That's a new development that I think speaks to what you're saying, where there is a shared cultural values at a generational level that transcend in some ways geographical boundaries.
Right.
And sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's not.
Right. Yeah, for sure. All right.
One other point on that, sorry, before we go into these key differences, and I mentioned this in the article. From a mission perspective, keep in mind that Gen Z, all except the very oldest, and even the very oldest, still, their brains are still developing, and so the ability to impact Gen Z is much greater than to impact a millennial. Not that we should give up on millennials, but their brains have been formed and their mindsets have been firmly established. Anyone who's Gen Z, they're still moldable and they can be influenced in ways that
especially the males. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because your brain doesn't stop forming until you're 25. So
24, 25. Yeah. I think in males, I think females are a little earlier. They mature a little sooner.
Probably so. So, I mean, at the time of this recording, the oldest folks in Gen Z are 23. So they're still moldable, and this is a good thing. So
no, they're 27.
Is that right?
27.
26. Yeah. Okay. I'm not hired for my math. Okay, but still, the majority of them are oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, sorry, I got my dates mixed up. The point still is the majority of folks in Gen Z are still going to have an openness to spiritual things that older folks will not have, including millennials. And so don't give up on this generation. Don't go, I don't understand them, and I don't understand their technology, and I don't understand their ways, and I don't like their Pride Progress flag, and I don't like this and that. Don't shut down. Engage, because you still have an opportunity to shape their minds in ways that you won't be able to shape other people's minds. So I want to encourage you in that.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, let's briefly, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but let's talk about some key differences between millennials and Gen Z.
Yeah, we have some key differences just to kind of understand the groups, and then we've got a few strategies for you for reaching them. So first of all, technology. I mean, this is probably the biggest thing that people think about in regard to technology. Millennials came of age. They reached, young adulthood really at the dawn of the internet. So, I mean, their adult lives have been spent on the internet, and even, late high school time. And Gen Z is 100% internet-based generation. They've never known not having the technology. And by the time they were old enough, the iPhone came out. What year iPhone came out? Like 9 or something?
2007.
So there you go. My 15-year-old was born the year that the iPhone came out. Smartphones have been a part of probably their consciousness the entire generation. So not only having the internet, but having access to it all the time is completely 100% natural for them. They are immersed in a digital world. So
this is a difference, though. This is a distinction. I think it's important. Millennials are comfortable with technology and familiar with it because they grew up around it. They don't have the symbiotic relationship with technology that Gen Z does. So, I mean, everyone in every generation, including baby boomers, can get addicted to their phones. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that preference for technology first and things like that. I still grew up. I was joking with my kids this past weekend about going to Blockbuster and, having to be sure you rewound the VHS tapes and, that whole experience. And yeah, we grew up with the internet, but it was a very different internet. One of the key differences isn't that we grew up with the internet versus Gen Z. It's that we didn't grow up with social media. When you think Gen Z, they grew up, Facebook comes out, 2005, 2004, 2005.
Yeah,
So
somewhere in there.
So most of these kids, they're born with social media existing, not just smartphones. And that's a key difference and impacts the way in which I think millennials use technology differently than Gen Z does. So all those things are important. So don't just think, oh, all young people, they're good at that technology. Actually, that's not true. You can meet a lot of sort of Luddite millennials who aren't as interested in social media or technology as those who are the younger generation, Gen Z.
Yeah, which is a good segue into our next point, and that's communication preferences. So it kind of breaks down, as you were saying, that Gen Z would prefer, probably their first preference would be digital communication, electronic communication, but the millennials more so, they're okay with a blend of that and having some face-to-face interaction. So how you choose, and this is especially important point in the church, because church often doesn't communicate well, or they don't communicate well to individual, groups of people. Usually churches are just kind of blanket stuff, like throw that out there. And instead of being more targeted. So it's important when you need to communicate the right message to the right people at the right time, is to use methods that they most are likely to use and engage with.
Yeah, I mean, this might blow your mind, but those who are millennials in your church probably check their email. Those who are Gen Z in your church may not even have an email, or they have an email just so that they can sign up for the things that they actually use, and they never check it. And so, well, your oldest, how old is
Alex? Is 19. He's a 2003.
Okay, so how often does Alex check his email?
I don't understand Alex with email. He's got a couple of accounts, a Gmail account, and that he uses for most things that he has to have an email. And I'm always following up. Me and Erica are always following up. Did you get that email about for school and stuff, college? I don't know. And so then he goes and checks his email and it's there. I'm like, I don't understand this. Every time I get an email, this thing dings, it lights up, it honks at me. You have an email. And I look at it and he stares at it all the time. How can you not know there's a new email there? But they don't care about communicating via email.
Right.
Texting is pretty good.
But that's not even going to be their primary. They're going to often communicate on social media apps.
That's right.
So, and what I'm trying to say out to that, AJ, is if you're thinking we are using technology for communication, we send a weekly email. The age cutoff for that's like 25. Anyone younger than that, and they're adults. They're not children.
Yeah.
Someone who's 25 is an adult. They are a full-fledged adult, and they probably don't. I mean, they maybe at that point, because they probably have a job, like maybe they're checking their email or whatever. Some, but they're not engaging with email. So yeah, that maybe means you have to have a social media communication strategy, because that's where they're communicating, and which means you need to know what social media platforms do they use. You may be like, well, we're on Facebook.
Oh, I got news.
They're not on Facebook.
Facebook is for old people.
Facebook is for you. Yeah.
That's how they think of Facebook.
Again, millennials are on Facebook. Listen, I'm almost 37. I'm on Facebook. Is Alex on Facebook?
He has an account, doesn't use it for anything. He's only friends with his parents, his grandparents.
Right. So this is the difference. I just want you to see the difference. If you think, oh, we're good at reaching those young people, we're on Facebook. Which young people are you talking about? Because millennials are on Facebook. Gen Z's not on Facebook.
Yeah. All right, here, let's blow the audience's mind.
Okay.
There's a thing called Discord. It's a
Oh
social
God.
media platform
Don't
that
don't put us in the position where you have to describe how this thing works, AJ.
you don't even know about it. I can't explain it. I don't know what it is. But my Gen Z spends all of his time communicating with his friend groups there. And this might be the first time you've ever heard of it. It's amazingly under the radar and hugely used. If you're a youth pastor and you're not on Discord, you're probably missing a primary place to communicate with your kids. So I mean, there you go. That's worth the price of this episode probably for you.
Yeah, don't ask us how you use it or how you engage on it or if it's owned by the Chinese. I know none of those things. I know TikTok's owned by the Chinese, but I don't know about Discord.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep moving.
All right. Job stability. So even this, Scott, even this as a topic, it just kind of occurred to me. A lot of people would think jobs, why would they have jobs? Aren't they like little kids?
Aren't they children?
They're not.
They're not.
They have jobs and careers and that's important to them. And so this is definitely a big division point. This is where generations begin to look differently depending on where you are in that generation. I mean, you, Scott, so millennials, yeah, you're married, you've got 2 kids, you own a house, you have a career, and you've worked a long time on your career. And Gen Z are just they're college age, and they're thinking about their careers. But so yeah, millennials. If you think millennials are a bunch of young people that may not even be in the workforce or they're working at fast food jobs, you're very mistaken. The millennials they're dealing with the same things in life, that every other generation has dealt with: raising a family, taking care of their housing needs, and all that. And Gen Z is going to be there in the next few years, or they're going to start getting into that.
Yeah, and millennials are defined. There are a few things that sort of shaped their perspective. One of those is the huge thing is the Great Recession. So, we were coming out of college at the same time the housing market collapsed in 2007, 2008. And, where a lot of us were getting our first jobs around then. Now I was insulated a little bit from that because I went into ministry. And so things were a little bit different in that career track. But for a lot of my friends and other folks who were graduating around this time, it was hard. It was hard to get a job. So our views on jobs and life are very different than Gen Z, which has had a different experience growing up where the job market's been relatively stable. And so they're more interested in, and this ties into their views on social issues too, which we'll talk about in a minute. But, way more interested in like finding a career that matches my unique personality and strengths. This is just not something that millennials are like, can I have a job and can I keep it? And can I pay off my student loans? And I mean, these are things that are prioritized by millennials versus Gen Z is way more likely to hop into the gig economy and, try to find creative ways to make money on the internet. This is something that a millennial would be like, can I find a reliable and safe way to make money on the internet? Because I might be interested in that. They're maybe a little less entrepreneurial, a little more risk averse because of the environment that they sort of were brought into when they graduated college.
Yeah. This is actually even an interesting one between you and I, Scott, because even whenever, you had this point in here about the Great Recession, and we had the housing crash in 2008. And I know that affected a ton of people across all generations, but I think less so in my generation and older. We were on our second, third house in that very stable and maintenance part of life. There wasn't a lot of, we weren't in that area of life in which maybe we were about to buy our first house or about getting out of the starter home and into maybe the next one. And that seriously affected us. We were just, I don't even think about that as a marker in life. I don't think about, oh boy.
Well, yeah. Really imagine graduating from college.
Yeah.
You got $60,000 in student loans, or maybe less, maybe more. I had less than that, but other people have more. So you're saddled with tens of thousands of dollars of student loan debt, and no one's hiring now.
Yeah,
And there's, and you can't afford a place to live. You've got mountains of debt. Yeah, that and you're 22 years old, 23 years old. That defines you in some way. It shapes your outlook on life.
Yeah. Yeah. I have much more thought in my mind about weathering the Cold War and the fear of Russian nuclear attack than the Great Recession or the housing crash of 2008. So.
Yeah, right. Right.
All right. The next piece, again, is kind of semi-related, is financial outlook. So millennials are just more cautious with their finances. I'm sure there's a lot of this is because of their upbringing, the things that their parents, grandparents probably imparted to them, and the environment that they were in. And we're getting focused on getting that student debt paid off. Gen Z, Gen Z is a little more free floating on everything, aren't they? I mean, like, definitely. I mean, I see this in my kids, a less of an understanding of what things cost and the value of a dollar. And my kids are very different.
No, this is age related.
Well.
Like, obviously, as you get older, you mature.
Yeah.
So I want to make that distinction. I would imagine that Gen Z will probably grow up a little bit, but especially, I mean, we don't know what will happen over the next couple of years, but if we hit another recession like we did in 2007, then you would be having a recession that's going to shape them in the same way that the Great Recession shaped my generation in 2007. Yeah. So some of this is up for changing, but just note that when you see a viral video online, this was a point you made before you start recording. When you see a viral video online of someone complaining, "Oh no, I had to work 8 hours today," that's not a millennial. That's not a millennial. That's a Gen Z person.
Yeah, if you don't get anything else out of that, Scott wants you to know that is not a millennial.
It's not a millennial. We're perfectly fine to put in the work. Yeah. We'll put in the hours.
Okay, so our next one, our last kind of key difference here is social issues. So, I think the millennials probably got a little bit more of a blended view, from the generations that they were raised under. Certainly moving towards, because technology made it possible, sustainability, wise choices, if things are pretty
environmental
close,
awareness.
I'm going to go with the one that's a better choice for everybody, for the planet, for people.
Reusable water bottles, like these kinds of things. Yeah. I'm not saying I'm personally big on these things, but others in my generation are, I should say.
Yeah. Whereas Gen Z are definitely more of the ones that are getting really worked up more recently about social issues. They're the ones mostly involved in the inclusivity and diversity and a lot of activism. Yeah.
Which wasn't really true of my. I mean, seriously, and I do think that the recession impacts this. You don't have time to go and protest when you're like, "Can I get a job, please?"
Yeah.
And so it isn't that the millennials don't care about some of these issues, but it was much more libertarian in the approach. Like, you do you. I don't care what you do. A lot of the stuff you used to hear, was millennial driven. Like, hey, love is love. You do you. Sort of this hands-off approach to social issues is more the millennial mode, whereas Gen Z values individual identity. So this idea of you must affirm
and group identity.
And yeah, interestingly. Yeah, but you must affirm all of what I say, even if I change my mind in 5 minutes. You must accept me for who I am right now in this moment. That's a Gen Z attitude, not a millennial one. Millennials might tolerate it, but it's not born from that. So know that when you see that kind of
blend out across all generations to some extent, but
to some extent. But so when you see that online, you should know that the genesis of that is much more Gen Z than millennial.
And that's a lot of that is fueled because of social media and technology. They're made aware of everything happening everywhere around the world every minute, and they can easily engage with each other and speak their minds about it. And it's easy to organize for protests or group think. So
Right.
a lot of these things are connected together.
What I want to say on that is the church will and does feel uncomfortable wading into those kinds of issues. But I really believe, and the reason I'm bringing this up is the solution is not to ignore them, but to engage with these topics from a biblical worldview. And that might be difficult. It might get you into some tricky situations and some hot water. That's fine. The worst thing you could do is just pretend that it doesn't exist and shut yourself off from it. Because they are still young. Gen Z's young. You can mold them, you can shape them, you can influence them. So don't be afraid of engaging when they say something that has no basis in reality. We need to engage with that, I think.
Yeah.
All right, so
let's move into some strategies.
Yeah. I really feel like, I know we spent a lot of time here actually, but I think it was good. It will help inform these strategies, and we don't need to spend loads of time walking through these strategies.
All right. So the first one is multi-generational groups. So, I mean, Scott, you and I work with a lot of churches, and we hear a lot of value or vision speak from them about being a multi-generational church. And most of the time, what they're saying is they want to mix generations together. They have a desire to see that happen. So there's frequently, though, a disconnect between their words and their actions. And I don't know that that's necessarily intentional. And usually it's probably, it's not intentional. So it takes intentionality and to really think about that. How are we going to change our ministries so that we actually do blend generations together? And so what do you think, if you don't go, sort of all in on making that happen, if you leave it as an option, be with people only in your generation or be with people across generation, do you think, where would they naturally go if they're going to choose one or the other? Because if you really want to be multi-generational, you probably need to just focus on that and not continue to have this menu of options where people become scattered and siloed.
Yeah, I mean, that would be it. I think that, people naturally want to be with people who are just like them. That's what we want. And the internet facilitates that. So all day, every day, you can be with people who are just like you.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting that the church should be different than that. It should force you into interactions and relationships that the internet does not force you into. And it might make you uncomfortable, and it might be difficult, and you might have to sacrifice something. But if you start from the perspective, especially if you're the boomer or the Gen X person, start from the assumption that I have something that I can give and I have something that I can learn, and it's not about me. It will be less comfortable for you to be in a relationship with someone who is a millennial or in Gen Z than for you to just be with other Gen X people, or for you to just be with other boomers. That will be way more comfortable. It
probably is the siloed generations that have accelerated the separation of groups of people and generations of people, because in the past, it was more natural to have cross-generational, multi-generational, intergenerational interactions.
Yeah.
I mean, even going back to biblical times, in tribes of people were growing up, were raising the kids, they interact with the adults. And you had these varying points of view that I think slowed down individualistic thought and less irrational thought, because again, a group of people whose brains aren't fully formed, you get 100 of them together with some brilliant idea, and all of a sudden they're all in, and they're fighting everybody to make sure that it happens. Whereas if they were with other people that are like, hold up a minute, have you thought about this though? That won't work because of this. Then they're like, okay, I get it. Maybe we can make a little change. Change in cultures and societies happen slower because of intergenerational input. And I think rapidly changing cultures that we see now is because of the separation.
Yeah, 150 years ago, the average person wasn't going to college to learn how to do a job and then getting a job and in a career or whatever. They were getting apprenticed to someone who was older than them in a career field. That's how most people, some people went to university, but it was a very small percentage of the population. Most people picked a trade, and you got apprenticed to someone who is older. You were forced into this intergenerational relationship with someone who is going to teach you about how to do a thing. And that's gone away. Now you put a whole bunch of 19-year-olds together in a room to teach them things, and it creates this weird groupthink, and it further solidifies a group identity or cultural identity or a generational identity separate and apart from the rest of the society.
Yeah.
And then the internet, I think, accelerates that to a significant degree. It's just not good or healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. So you want to slow down the rise of crazy, right or left things happening in culture. Be a church that truly produces people who are set apart. And you'll be noticeably set apart when the kids, young adults coming out of your church are a little bit more well-balanced and thoughtful. So I think multi-generational ministry will accomplish that.
Yep.
All right, our next one, innovative uses of technology. And we kind of touched on this earlier. How we use our technology to reach different generations in the church has got to be a focus of those that are in those leadership positions. Because you're gonna miss opportunities to communicate. They're going to take things. They're either not going to hear it at all, or they're not going to understand exactly what you're saying based on how they hear it. So this is an important aspect for churches to employ as a strategy tool.
Yeah. A lot of churches feel like, well, man, we're using technology now because the pandemic forced you to, in a lot of ways, so now you're live streaming your services, and now you're putting some stuff on Facebook, and you didn't used to do that. I'm going to suggest that you're still probably behind a lot on technological innovation. And a lot of that was thrown together last minute. It wasn't necessarily an intentional strategy. You were just, adapting to the situation as it was. I'm encouraging you to think differently about technology. Using technology just to use technology is not helpful either. So instead, think through, create an intentional strategy for using technology to engage the youngest generations and recognize those differences between millennials and Gen Z. So thinking going all in on Facebook, when we know that Gen Z doesn't use Facebook, that's not going to work either. So a comprehensive digital strategy that reaches millennials and Gen Z. So I want to throw out a couple. I'm not even going to go into detail. I've got several ideas, just random things posted in the article. I'm not going to go over all of them. You can go on the article and read them, but a couple of things that I like. Create a YouTube specific sermon series. So not just your sermon series that you post on that you do on Sundays. That's 35 minutes long. People generally aren't going to watch that on YouTube. We post these podcasts on YouTube. Some of you watch this full 40-minute thing. Very few. YouTube's built for videos that are 12 minutes or less. And so make some content that's YouTube first. That's some medicine that we want to be taking that medicine ourselves here at some point. Creating interactive sermon notes. I like this idea. This idea of have a version of your sermon notes that's digital that includes links to YouTube videos, or links to articles, or links to other things, so that people can explore more on their own at home. It's not just the outline. That's a way to engage that group. Something my church is doing, I think it's cool. Making a Spotify playlist of the worship music that you sing, so that people don't listen to the radio. If you're thinking, oh, we're singing this song because it's on Christian radio, great. All the boomers in your church will know the song. That's not how Gen Z and millennials are listening to worship music. They're listening to it on Spotify or Apple Music or one of these other. So create playlists on there that people can subscribe to and listen to. So I've got lots of other ideas that are listed. They're not definitive. They're just creative ways to leverage technology to engage the youngest generations.
Yeah. I mean, you've got interactive sermon notes on here, Scott. We just talked to my son before we went live, and because I'm like, you know what? My son does something on his phone for the sermon notes. I don't know what it is. And so he's like, yeah, Dad, our church has an app. The sermon notes are there. You can put your stuff in there and saves it. And I'm like, okay, cool, great. I don't do
Like
that.
your church is doing it, you didn't even know.
I fill in the blanks. And then, you know what happens? I come home from church, I filled in the blanks, I wrote some notes down. They sit on my desk for a while. And then when I clean my desk, they all get thrown into paper recycle bin under my desk. And Alex has all of his stuff because he carries around with him on his phone. So he probably is doing it a better way than I am. So yeah, you can try that. All right. Yeah. So again, go over to today's show notes. We'll give you that link there at the end, and there's several more examples on there for you to peruse. All right, our last piece here is mentorship programs. This is taking multi-generational ministry to the next level because it brings it down into an individual relationship, and a lot can happen between two people. Then just going deeper on something, and so this is a great. And don't think of this necessarily as a ministry of the church. Think of this as a culture you want to develop in your church, because it should be happening on multiple levels. And on a discipleship level, it should be happening in a leadership level. It should be happening on volunteer development, leadership development level. There's mentoring between two people, whereas an experienced person is helping bring up a less experienced person in almost any area of life or ministry has great value. Obviously it's one-on-one, so it has to happen across a broad spectrum, to be effective. But again, this is why it's more effective as a culture than it necessarily would be as a ministry, though you need to start somewhere. And so developing a mentorship program is probably what you would even call it. Oh, it has a new mentorship program. I mean, great. Whatever you need to do to get people engaged in it to start. But at some point it becomes the way you operate as a church, and everybody is would understand the value of it. You never get 100% engagement, but the more the better. And the more you talk about the value of it and you're able to demonstrate that, the greater participation you'll see.
Yeah. When we work with churches in our leadership pipeline process, we really build out a system and process that essentially accomplishes this. It creates mentorship opportunities built into the way that you operate your ministries. But if that's not the way you're approaching ministry, you're doing other things. At minimum, start some sort of a mentorship program, maybe as an aspect of your small groups ministry. Sort of subdivide those small groups into mentor-mentee relationships. Something that encourages that life-on-life interaction, and you really want to put the onus on the older folks to offer that. A young person is probably unlikely to ask, "Hey, will you mentor me?" But to make it a visible option. Actually, AJ, you and I were looking at some data from Barna yesterday, talking about how these ideas of training pathways or empowering young leaders. And what was interesting is those who are in leadership and have been a part of a church for a long time were significantly more likely to perceive that the church does have training pathways and does empower leaders than people who are newer to the church and aren't currently in leadership. And the takeaway from that, for me, is that perception is reality. If you're on the outside looking in, you feel like there's not a pathway for me. There's not an opportunity for me to grow or to have a relationship or to be trained or to be mentored. And it doesn't matter whether that or not that's actually true. What matters is they perceive that there isn't an ability for that to happen, which makes it true in their experience. That's a very millennial thing for me to say. I'm not saying it doesn't matter that it doesn't exist, but it may as well not exist if they don't know that it exists. And so it's important that you create these opportunities. If you really want to have multi-generational ministry, you got to put in the work by fostering those relationships to happen in a small group environment, by leveraging technology in intentional and creative ways beyond just live streaming your services on Facebook. And you need to create mentorship programs where you are having people do deeper work than just casual friendships that you might have in a small group environment.
Yeah. All right. With that, we're bringing this long episode of the Church Revitalization Podcast to a close. And if you made it this far, wow, good on you. Send us a message saying, I did it. I persevered to the end. Because we would love to know who you are. So you could read today's show notes over at malphursgroup.com/186. And as usual, I've been mentioning this a lot lately, as a nonprofit ministry that's doing work all around the world, we need your help doing that. So please consider donating to the Malphurs Group or becoming a mission partner between us and your church. So while you're at malphursgroup.com, click on the donate button over there in the top, and we'll begin that conversation with you. Thanks for being with us, and we will see you next week.